So I'm going to just briefly introduce my grad student who's the chair of this panel, Cameron Zinsou, who's a PhD student, as I said, under my direction. He received his BA and MA from University of North Texas, where he worked with Dr. Citino. He researches civil military relations and occupation in southern France during World War II. Zinsou has published several book reviews from 2015 to 2018. He served as a graduate student representative for the Society for Military History. And then in 2015 also, he participated as a research fellow in the Iraqi Freedom Study Group at the National Defense University. So Cameron, I'll turn it over to you.
Hey everyone. So this afternoon's panel is Landscapes of Gender, Hunger, and Conscription. I have two distinguished scholars with me. Our first speaker will be Dr. Katrin Paehler. She's an associate professor at Illinois State University. In her research and teaching specializes on Nazi Germany, the Holocaust, foreign intelligence, genocide, and mass violence, as well as history, memory, and the representations. She is author of the Third Reich's Intelligence Service, The Career of Walter Schellenberg, and she co-edited A Nazi Past, Recasting German Identity in Post-War Europe. She has several more publications, which would take entirely too long to read. Her paper today is The Space Between, Hildegard, Beetz, Espionage, and Gender, 1944 to 1945.
Thank you
or
so
49.
much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for a lovely introduction. This is not the great American novel. This is me trying to figure out how to be middle-aged and virtually blind. So, I basically have 4 or 5 lines on each page. The counterintelligence detachment arrived at the house in mid-June 1945. They had learned that, quote, an important woman executive and agent who likely had, quote, the personal diaries of the late Count Ciano lived there. The 25-year-old woman, Hildegard Beetz, did not have the diaries, but dug up from her mother's garden copies of other Ciano documents as well as additional materials. What might have surprised the Americans more, the document windfall or the self-possessed 25-year-old greeting them? Born in 1919 to a middle-class family, a talented linguist, industrious and ambitious, Beetz came to SS Foreign Intelligence in a roundabout way. Technically in an administrative position, she took on additional responsibilities first in Berlin and then later on in Rome, where after her male supervisors blundered themselves back to Germany, she functioned as the main representative. After July 1943, she took on a leading role in the office's attempt to exchange Italian Foreign Minister Galeazzo Ciano, his life and his freedom for his diaries. The German intelligence service meant to use the diaries to depose German Foreign Minister Ribbentrop and to replace them with one of theirs. These efforts failed, and Ciano was executed in early 1944. Subsequently, Beetz was charged with keeping tabs on his widow, Edda Ciano, born Mussolini. Over the course of the so-called Ciano affair, Beetz's role became increasingly ambiguous. Committed to the broad outlines of her mandate, her German mandate, Beetz tried first to spare Ciano's life and then made possible his widow's escape to Switzerland with the prized diaries. Yet Beetz also procured for her service most of Ciano's documents. And charged with translating them, she kept copies, which she then handed over to the Americans. Today, I want to focus on where this story leaves off, namely on Beetz's interactions with her US handlers and her career between the summer of 1945 and the summer of 1949. How did this woman, who worked for the SS Foreign Intelligence Service, remake herself into a well-respected American asset? How did Beetz navigate the political and personal Zeitenwende and the space between? So there are any number of studies on male Nazi officials taken on by US and other occupational powers intelligence services, and on the active roles these men played in their recasting. But we know very little about women, either on an individual or on a collective level. Beetz' story fills a gap here and holds much broader implications, I would argue. Elsewhere, I've proposed the existence of what I call the new Nazi woman, modern, ambitious women who, in Wendy Lower's words, saw, quote, a professional opportunity and a liberating experience, and were quite comfortable in Nazi Germany, used to their fullest advantage its racist and imperial designs, and ably worked the system, and within the system its commonly understood notions of acceptable female roles to their benefit. Today, I argue that Beetz's experiences here in Nazi Germany, in particular her ability to navigate complicated administrative structures and her ability to adhere to and to subvert gendered expectation, equipped her to navigate Nazism's end, to thrive in the post-war era, and to make the space between work to her advantage. Put differently, Nazism made her, grounded her, and made possible her later careers. I'm first going to talk about Beetz's initial interactions with US intelligence agencies, focusing on her ability to serve the needs of the United States while establishing her own credentials and employment. I then detail her role in the high-stakes Berlin spy game, showing her as an able operator and an outspoken, if self-appointed, intelligence expert, accepted by the Americans as such. Lastly, I'm going to touch upon the beginning of Beetz's career in journalism, which was a side effect of her work for US intelligence. So in 1945, Beetz fell on the fringes of the automatic arrest categories. She had not been a high-level office holder, but her administrative position and her role in the Ciano affair made her stand out and positioned her well. From the start, Beetz was forthright and detailed about her past, but made it clear that, quote, in a sense, she double-crossed the SD, so the intelligence service. The proof was in the proverbial pudding. Beetz had already handed over Ciano-related documents and divulged the location of additional collections. Additionally, the Americans knew that the Ciano diaries were in the possession of his widow, living, thanks to Beetz, in Switzerland. Beetz's relationship with Wilhelm Höttl, who had held prominent positions in SS intelligence, added to her importance to the Americans. Höttl had alerted the Americans to Beetz's whereabouts, and the Americans had also carried a letter from Höttl to Beetz, which indicated that Höttl planned to work for the Americans, wanted Beetz to join him, and trusted her. Beetz did not return the sentiment. She reported that she had double-crossed him multiple times and warned the Americans that Höttl had discussed post-defeat plans, including using the American service as a cover for his own operations. In short, Beetz portrayed Höttl as dangerous, which was quite congruent with the Americans' views on him, but also as gullible. Herself, she painted as an expert on the man. Within days, the Americans were talking about using Beetz in an intelligence operation against Höttl, and Beetz took part in shaping these plans. In a general conversation, Beetz suggested that if she went to work for Höttl, she would be in an excellent position to watch him on our behalf. That is what the Americans write, obviously. At the same time, Beetz, perhaps playing coy, and most certainly her cards right, also claimed not to be too keen to, quote, enter this type of work again, end quote. However, these protests appear to be fake, as preparations soon commenced, and there's no indication that Beetz was pressured to participate in this new operation. To burnish her credibility, Beetz provided systematic and coherent testimony on the Ciano affair. Presumably refreshingly to the Americans, her statements lacked the self-aggrandizing innuendo one finds in interrogations of SD men. The Americans concluded that she was a, quote, attractive young woman and a, quote, extremely intelligent person with excellent memory, whose statements checked out. One reckons that her gender and her looks, combined with her knowledge and her willingness to give precise information, especially in comparison to many of her male colleagues, predisposed her interrogators towards her. Indeed, a very intriguing disconnect developed between Beetz's self-portrayal and the American views of her. And gendered expectations took center stage. In an early Lebenslauf, Beetz rendered herself a capable woman with agency, smarter and more professional than many of her male superiors. She also spoke frankly about her early enthrallment with Nazism, likely reasoning that her gender, her officially subaltern position, and her role in the Ciano affair protected her from imprisonment, basically. In addition, she was also not auditioning for substantial future employment in US intelligence. In contrast, and that is very interesting, US summaries on her statements subtly reconfigured Beetz's statements and made them cohere with assumptions about women's roles in Nazi Germany. So in those summaries, Beetz appeared much younger, less confident, less qualified, and void of much of her agency. So the Americans, eager to recruit her, created an asset that was magically both eminently capable and largely innocent. Yet in their eagerness to recruit her, the Americans lost interest in information Beetz could have provided. So put briefly, the present and the future trumped the past. The past was not important anymore. By July 1945 already, so a good month after she had been taken into custody, Beetz was deployed in a scheme to exploit Hödel. The operation setup betrayed her special status already, even if the Americans did not trust her fully. Beetz passed with flying colors and thereafter became a penetration agent in Munich. A vetting request highlighted her allure to the Americans. She was, quote, highly intelligent, end quote, fluent in several languages, trustworthy, and no, quote, disciple of Nazi ideals. Trusted by her former colleagues, she was seen as likely to be contacted by them, and owing to her knowledge and her, quote, insight into the German mind, end quote, she would be able to evaluate them and their information. But US intelligence also held control factors. Her ongoing freedom was dependent on her collaboration, as was the fate of her husband, who was a POW. So within a matter of weeks then, Beetz had established her standing. And like in 1943, 1944, Beetz showed agency. If in an unthreatening, gendered fashion, she was prepared when the Americans arrived and skillfully anticipated her interrogators' next moves thereafter. Beetz was very much in charge of her own destiny. She knew how to play with the big boys or play the big boys, did it well, and paved her path forward. And she even settled a score or two along the way. Berlin. They did not call post-war Berlin Kidnapped City for nothing. In the late summer of 1946, Beetz found herself at the center of a daring scheme in Berlin. So US intelligence was interested in Soviet penetration efforts and the Soviet case officer, Captain Skurin in particular. After running into trouble with their initial double agent and having to remove him from Berlin, US intelligence doubled another one of Skurin's agents, codenamed Ford. Beetz, for her part, was to become a sitting duck in Omgus for Soviet penetration efforts. In short, the objective was to ensnare Skurin, and Beetz was the bait. She was deemed perfect for the assignment. She had the professional qualifications for a cover job. She was considered an intelligence, quote, professional able to handle intricate relationships involved in top-level double agent operations, end quote, and deemed to hold anti-Nazi convictions developed prior and during the war in a westward orientation. In addition, her husband remained in US custody. Once again, she was not a pawn or pressed into service, but rather on board with a plan. The operation, however, raised rather tremendous security concerns. Beetz was a former German intelligence operative, and as witnessed in 43-44, a damn good one. Her file notes that, quote, extraordinary pains to examine the agent's background were taken because of the extremely delicate vis-à-vis Omgus project, and the possibility that her association with Ciano might someday lead someone, through misunderstanding, to believe us to be harboring a wicked internationally notorious queen of spies. The thick irony aside, the employment of a former Nazi operative at Omgus under a fake name and under a fake identity violated security regulations, even if Omgus security was on board. But Beetz had persuaded the Americans of both her anti-Nazi credentials and of the excellence of her work for Nazi Germany. And her new posting was predicated on both and turned her Nazi past, a liability, into a post-war asset. The operation quickly took unexpected turns. Initially, Skurin did not take the bait, and there was talk about removing Beetz from Omgus. It remains unclear whether US intelligence was short on patience or concerned about security violations after all. Then Ford reported that Skurin had asked after Beetz but did not know her whereabouts. US intelligence then decided to fan Soviet interest actively and have Ford disclose her presence at Omgus. Again, Beetz was part of the discussion and apparently bored by her office job, eager and excited about the operation revving up. It became clear that the Soviets intended to lure Beetz into the Soviet zone in Berlin, either to double her or to abduct her. Conversely, the Americans planned to blackmail Skurin into becoming a double. A visit of Ford and Beetz to a house concert in the French zone in 1947 was the operation's culmination. It was expected that Skurin would try to nab Beetz then. Conversely, the Americans were planning to use the opportunity to get Skurin. However, in the end, nothing happened. Something spooked the Soviets, and no attempt was made to grab Beetz, also derailing any American plans. So the operation never came back to life and petered out in early summer of 1947. Once again, Beetz had been very much at the center of things, at the center of this daring scheme. Despite efforts to protect her, it could have easily gone south. But she saw herself as a professional and did not suffer men she deemed fools easily, as reports by her and Ford on their first meeting indicate. Ford, apparently unaware that Beetz was in on the Americans' plans, opened his report with a comment about her quote-unquote disorderly room. He then related that he admitted working for the Russians, who were interested in her, and had warned Beetz that they might move against her mother still living in Weimar. Beetz, claiming that she liked his openness, gave him some information about her job. Ford, in his report, pronounced Beetz, quote, rather sharp, and opined that she was, quote, a cat who's morally probably quite loose, something he presumably deduced from the state of her room. Beetz's report, on the other hand, included details on the Soviet interest in her, but importantly noted that Ford fairly clearly indicated his status as a double agent, advised her to give him information to improve his standing, and promised that if she were arrested, he would get himself arrested for an exchange. In short, during the first meeting, Ford divulged trade secrets and fashioned himself as her protector. And he invited her to the theater. Beetz noted that this would be good in her report, as the Russians would thus know about their acquaintanceship, a professional tip for which Ford thanked her. Thereafter, Ford settled in and gave her the story of his life. Beetz pronounced him in her report as, quote, well-meaning, reliable, but not too intelligent, end quote, and tartly noted, quote, as for his professional qualifications, it was too bad that he had not had the benefit of Amt 6 SS intelligence schooling, end quote. In other words, she reminded the Americans of her value as an asset due to her SS training and painted Ford as a well-meaning and well-intentioned bore. Beetz later reported of an unannounced visit, oh my God, we have a problem, of an unannounced visit by Ford during which he poured out quite a portion of his soul and aired his dislike of both the American and the Russians, praised Hitler and the Führer principle while bemoaning some excesses, and showed himself as an idealistic Nazi. Beetz noted that she filed the report because she deemed Ford to be too interested in her, too afraid for this line of work, and probably unwilling to embrace aggressive approaches. The report's subtext was not that subtle. Beetz cast herself as a polar opposite, a consummate professional willing to take risks and committed to her task. Her US miners agreed, setting her up at the center of yet another, yet less dangerous operation. Arno Scholz, the editor of the Berlin Telegraph, I'm not using all of that, don't be afraid. A social democratic daily paper, worked for American intelligence. Under the code name of Camlet, he collected information on the SPD and related and related issues. In the fall of 47, the Americans, with Scholz's knowledge and approval, attached Beetz to him as his secretary to increase and to coordinate his output. Scholz did not have the entire story here. He neither knew of Beetz's real identity or her Nazi intelligence background, nor the full scope of her brief. She was also to report on the Telegraph and to observe Scholz. Over the next year, Beetz focused on Scholz, the paper's East Office, Ostbüro, German officials and civilians from the Soviet zone, and eventually also on the Berlin SPD, while making a career at the Telegraph. So she begins to work as a journalist here, making quite a lovely career. But most importantly, she became what I call the Scholz whisperer, because she cons him into divulging information during their joint meetings with the American handlers. So based on her drive and ability and on our sponsorship, an American report held she was being, quote, groomed for an important position at the Telegraph. And US intelligence had big plans for her. Beetz was to supersede Camlet, Scholz that is, and use, quote, to the full the information gathering facilities of the paper and the East Office. Eventually, the Americans came to value her so much that she was placed on the US evacuation list before the beginning of the Berlin blockade. However, she also knew too much at this point. So Beetz's journalistic career and intelligence career continued hand in hand. By the late spring of 49, she was the editor of the Telegraph's West German edition, which was published out of Frankfurt. Her cover remained intact. Her loyalty to the Americans was undoubted, and she was deemed, quote, professional agent caliber. And it was assumed that she would eventually receive, quote, sufficient operational latitude to organize her own information net. And in Frankfurt, her brief extended quite substantially. She was to keep tab on the Western federal government, political targets of opportunity, SPD, parliamentary representation, executive, and various key government officials. And she has been briefed to pay particular attention to the extreme right and the extreme left. The bureaucratic language here obscures an important fact, I would argue. Beetz had been made and had made herself into the perfect agent to keep tabs on a government with a strong SPD social democratic component based out of Frankfurt. However, the West German elections of September 1949 created what? A CDU-led government out of Bonn. Oopsie. So over the next 2 years, the relationship between Beetz and the CIA begins to peter out, the official relationship. Her location in Frankfurt and American intelligence's claims that she was, quote unquote, too emotional were both used to explain away how a very sophisticated initial setup had yielded very few results. Additionally, a change in US operational setup in Germany had brought along new personnel with different mindsets, and it also included a restoration of traditional gender norms in the United States, which meant that there was no longer space for Hildegard Beetz. What remained, however, was Hildegard Blum, later Hilde Purwin, journalist. Indeed, she remained in this most prominent position until the 1980s. So Beetz built her post-war career not out of the ashes of her pre-war and wartime career, but on top of it, out of it. It's not the ashes, it's still there. It was the education and expertise she acquired as a new Nazi woman that allowed her to thrive in her subaltern positions. She had learned her trade and dealt with the likes of Hödel and Kaltenbrunner, keeping her cool and playing them while using both gender and gendered norms to create Handlungsspielräume, scopes for action that suited her. And in the liminal space post-May 1945, she adapted those abilities to the new circumstances, while also showing well-calculated disdain for a system and its men that she had served short of a notable exception in 44 with 43-44 with Ciano, diligently for years. But she clearly held her Nazi spy background in esteem. So much so that she reminded her US handlers of it. And especially in the early years, that accorded with the US view of the SS intelligence service. The realization that it had been an epic failure did not make it into the field all that quickly. That the US service was all too happy to rely on former Nazis, using them for American purposes against each other, and ultimately also against democratic politicians in West Germany, is not exactly news. Different from others, though, Beetz attained, with American assistance, but based on her own ambition and smarts, a position in political journalism, from which she could have informed on West German political players and processes for years. Similar to her situation in Nazi Germany, Beetz benefited from the contradictory gender expectations the Americans brought with them. Another liminal space, I would argue, especially in the immediate post-war years. She simultaneously conformed to and confounded gendered expectations. She was young, and she was pretty, and she was in need of protection. She was attractive, she was smart, she was wily, and a source of good reporting, a veritable femme fatale, if formerly Nazi. Later still, at a point when both US intelligence and gender norms settled into the post-war period, these traits were used to discredit her and to explain away the failure of this ambitious US intelligence scheme. Beetz, for her part, made the best out of everything and came out on top as an established journalist with far-reaching context. Continuities between Nazi Germany and the post-war period come in many shapes. One of them was Hildegard Beetz and her transition from espionage to journalism. But maybe it was based primarily, quote, on the ease with which she handled case officers for her own benefit. Thank you so much.
Our next speaker is Dr. Kristin Mulready-Stone. She is an associate professor and director of the Writing and Teaching Excellence Center at the U.S. Naval War College. She earned her PhD in the history of modern China from Yale University, where she studied with Jonathan Spence. Prior to starting at the Naval War College in June 2016, Dr. Mulready-Stone was tenured faculty in the history department at Kansas State University. Her research focuses on youth and youth organizations in Shanghai, China, in the interwar period up through World War II. In 2014, she published her first book, Mobilizing Shanghai Youth, CCP Internationalism, GMD Nationalism, and Japanese Collaboration, 1920 to 1942. Her paper today is titled Enemy Conscription, Japanese Efforts to Police Shanghai After Pearl Harbor.
Thanks so much, Cameron. Before I get started, I do want to go back to what we were discussing earlier of the small world aspect of this. Cameron came up to chat with me over the lunch break and asked if I know Mike Hankins, who was one of our star PhD students at K-State, and who also studied with Rob Citino and was a classmate of Cameron's while they were all at University of North Texas. So I texted Mike after lunch, and he wrote back and asked me to give you both his very best. You bet. Okay, so on to the subject at hand. I, too, will be looking over my shoulder regularly for my slides. As an employee of the U.S. government, here is my required statement that I always must include. I actually consulted with colleagues before this. I said, if I'm talking only about World War II and not drawing connections to today, do I have to put that statement up there? And they said, yeah, you have to put that statement up there. So there you have it. This is me. This is not the U.S. government. So the focus of my research is on the city of Shanghai in China. In the conversations that I've had with some of you in the last few days, I said that I keep coming back to Shanghai because it's such a fascinating city. And since I am the only East Asianist here, I'm going to spend some time orienting you all to the city first so that what I will be talking about will make sense. Shanghai was a very unusual place. It was a really backwater city up until the end of the First Opium War, at which point the British gained through the Treaty of Nanjing the rights to conduct trade in Shanghai, which turned it from a small semi-backwater city into the early stage metropolis that it is today. So I want to show you a map first, and you can see all these divisions on this map. So I'll step aside, hopefully you can still hear me, but in this lower portion here in green, that is the original Chinese city. Then in this red, pink area, that is known as the French concession. So in the late 1840s, the French gained the right to run this territory as they saw fit under extraterritoriality. So the French residents there were subject to French law, not Chinese law, because Chinese law was much more harsh, far more death penalty and such things there. The British, before the French, the British and Americans actually, gained control of this area, which was known as the International Settlement, and that's the part of the city that I will be speaking about the most. This area here is known as Jiabei, often transliterated as Cha Pei, if any of you have read about the Battle of Shanghai. And so that becomes it's a Chinese-controlled part of the city, but it comes under significant Japanese occupation towards the end of the Battle of Shanghai in 1937. And then this is the area that is known as the the Japanese Quarter. It's written in French up there, which is why I said French Quarter. But that was the area increasingly controlled by the Japanese after 1931 with the Manchurian crisis. Okay, so these divisions in the city are really quite crucial to the role of Shanghai at many stages in 19th and 20th century city. The Chinese city, prior to the Japanese victory in the Battle of Shanghai in the fall of 1937, the Chinese city was run by the Chinese authorities. But these borders between the Chinese-controlled parts of the city, the French-controlled, French concession, and the British and American-dominated international settlement meant that Shanghai was a magnificent place for people who were doing things that any one of these governments didn't care for to operate, because it was quite easy for them to cross over the border from Chinese city, French concession, international settlement. And so this is a big part of the reason why Shanghai was the birthplace of the Chinese Communist Party. None of these territories were thrilled with communism, and so the communists set up significant presence in the French concession, but often filtered over into the international settlement, less so the Chinese city in the 1920s, in the early 1920s, in the early years of the Chinese Communist Party. Once we get to World War II, whether you want to say World War II in this part of the world started in 31 or 37, the hot war that endured began outside Beijing in July of 1937 and came to Shanghai in mid-August of 1937. And it's at this point that the concession areas, the international settlement and the French concession, become even more interesting and important, but also complicated, because the Western powers that controlled these areas were neutral in this war until Pearl Harbor. So as the Japanese and Chinese were battling it out for the city, they were not battling over the French concession and the international settlement. And the British and the Americans and the French and the other foreign powers that were involved in the administration of the international settlement had to be very careful at all times not to provoke the Japanese, not to give any indication that they were violating the terms of neutrality that would give the Japanese an excuse to come in and take over these very well-developed, prosperous commercial areas in the city of Shanghai. So the Battle of Shanghai ran from mid-August to mid-November of 1937. The British Army and the U.S. 4th Marines had a significant presence of patrol in the international settlement. And they were often very nervous about collateral damage to the settlement, particularly when this area of Jiabei and purple became the primary battleground in Shanghai. They were very concerned about artillery shells damaging the settlement, and the Brigadier General of British forces and the General of the 4th Marines frequently crossed the bridge over the creek from the international settlement into Jiabei to negotiate with the forces that were fighting there, both Chinese and with the Japanese authorities as well. So this Suzhou Creek here is a 50-yard wide creek that separated the international settlement on the western portion of this from the Chinese-controlled portion of the city, where the Japanese and Chinese troops were fighting it out quite ferociously. So the British and American commanders were constantly trying to negotiate this situation to prevent themselves from getting damaged or having buildings suffer significant damage, having casualties in all of this. Okay. Once the battle is over and the Japanese have won by November 11th of 1937, the foreign concessions remained in place, and they had to be even more careful not to provoke the Japanese at this point. So the Japanese frequently demanded the ability to march their forces through the settlement, which they technically didn't have the right to do, but oftentimes the British and Americans allowed them to do so under certain circumstances with certain restrictions. The Chinese in the city were not at all thrilled with the Japanese, and even though they had not been thrilled with Western imperialism before that, they were far more afraid of the Japanese than they were of the Westerners. And so when this battle for Shanghai in 1937 was winding down, hundreds of thousands of Chinese fled into the international settlement and French concession as refugees because they feared for their safety under Japanese control. Another aspect of this is that the battle after Shanghai, the battle spread to Nanjing, which was the capital of nationalist China. It fell by December of 1937, and nationalist forces and government fled south and west. At this point, there was not much of a resistance presence, at least not officially, from the nationalist forces and government under Chiang Kai-shek because they had fled. But by 1938, mid-1938, a very sophisticated, organized resistance mechanism did spring up in the concession areas in Shanghai. Okay, so because of this, and because of the fact that you had the communists and the nationalists battling it out in China against each other, even during World War II, and fighting against the Japanese, and there were actual bandits, security in Shanghai was very, very challenging. And so the Japanese occupation forces had a manpower problem because they had originally expected this battle for Shanghai to last 3 weeks and the war not to last much longer than that at all. But instead, they got really bogged down in fighting Chinese forces for years, which meant they didn't have the manpower to police the city the way they needed to. Particularly complicating for the Japanese was the fact that you had these resistance elements very well established inside the city under Western governance to a degree, anyway. And so these underground resistance forces frequently launched attacks against the collaborationist, puppet government, as well as Japanese occupation authorities. And so the collaborationist government was constantly referring to bandit attacks in Shanghai against the collaborationist government and the Japanese occupation authorities. And so the bandit reference could mean anything. It could mean actual bandits. It often meant communist forces, for the Japanese were extremely anti-communist, but it was also nationalists, those loyal to Chiang Kai-shek, launching attacks against collaborationist, the government as well as collaborators in general. So the original approach to street-level peace and security was for the Japanese collaborationist regime to set up a youth organization. Youth organizations were crucial in trying to build the future of China, trying to gain the future, bring the future of China to one's own side. So the communists had one, the nationalists had a youth organization, and the collaborationist regime set one up as well. What the puppet regime did, the collaborationist government did, was to require a neighborhood in the city or in a village or in a township outside the city, if they wanted to set up a self-defense corps, first they were required to set up this youth organization known as the China Youth Corps. Then they were permitted to set up these street-level, neighborhood-level self-defense corps. Some of these corps were armed, some were not. But what they were trying to do, whether they were actual collaborators or not, was simply to make their neighborhoods safer, more predictable, and more calm. If it was going to be peaceful under the Japanese, they wanted it to be actually peaceful so that they could go to work, their kids could go to school, they could rebuild if there was damage from the battle, and on and on. Okay, so the best example I have of one of these branches of the China Youth Corps being set up has to do with one of these refugee camps that I mentioned earlier. There was one right on the edge of the French concession from 1937 to 1940. And by 1940, things had settled down enough in the city that most of those hundreds of thousands of people who had fled to the concessions had gone home. So in the spring of 1940, this particular refugee camp was shut down. While it was there, though, it was patrolled by the French forces. When it was no longer there, this area that was technically outside the French concession suddenly was dealing with all these bandit attacks. So you suddenly had Chinese people living in that neighborhood saying, we want a self-defense corps. We want a self-defense corps. They said, fine, create a China Youth Corps, go through all the training and indoctrination, then you can build the self-defense component of it. And they readily agreed and did that. So this was how the Japanese and the collaborators tried to make up the gap in their manpower problem, giving incentives to people who may or may not have had any sympathy for the collaborationist cause to cooperate with them for their own good, to allow their neighborhoods to be more safe and secure. So this went on until about March of 1942. By late 1941, there were significant problems. Unlike the other youth organizations of the communists and the nationalists, which had to operate underground, the China Youth Corps could operate in the open, which made it vulnerable to attack. And so there was constant cross-infiltration among these youth organizations. And the nationalists in particular were doing a very, very good job of infiltrating this collaborationist youth corps. And their weaponry had a pesky habit of disappearing and winding up in the wrong hands. And so the collaborationist government and the Japanese Occupation Authority are looking at this all the time saying, what are we going to do? So in the fall of 1941, they launched an investigation into the entire China Youth Corps structure, not just in Shanghai, but in the territory they controlled in the surrounding provinces. Part of the frustration in this is that this investigation was set to wind down on December 14th, 1941, a week after Pearl Harbor. With Pearl Harbor, and the United States coming into the war, and the war against Japan and the war against Germany means Britain's in on this as well, so the concessions can no longer be neutral. So all of the protection for the underground resistance elements is about to disappear, and they know it, so they hastily disappear from the city. They withdraw. The Japanese forces do not immediately take the concession areas, but by the end of December, they have done so. The investigation that they had been conducting into the self-defense corps, we don't know how that wound up in the end, because most of the records that we had on that came from the nationalist underground resistance organizations, which fled before this investigation was over. So by March of 1942, the collaborationist government has said, we're doing away with the China Youth Corps because it's complicated. Truly, that's the explanation they gave. It's complicated, and the future is complicated. So we don't know quite what happened, but it seems pretty clear that because of this cross-infiltration and spying, that the simple operation of the China Youth Corps and its self-defense corps was making policing way more vulnerable. So the China Youth Corps security apparatus with this self-defense corps was an opt-in situation. It was not compulsory, and so people who cooperated with it were seen completely as collaborators. What Japan and the collaborationist government decided it needed to do instead, clearly drove them off with some 50th word of collaboration. That's the end of the compulsion, that's right. And so what the collaborationist government and Japanese authorities seem to have decided was that we cannot have this be voluntary anymore because the people who are volunteering are seen as collaborators and then they will be attacked. If, conversely, we make this compulsory and we make all able-bodied men between age 20 and 45 do this, they'll be less likely to be attacked because everybody's forced to do it. The calculation seems to have been people will still want their neighborhoods to be safe and secure. And even though most of the resistance organizations fled, there were still resistors, and so attacks were ongoing. So this is where it's going to be tough to follow for a minute, because I'll be speaking about both the Self-Defense Corps, which was dissolved, and what replaced it, which is known as the Self-Policing Corps. Okay, so they're two very different organizations. So again, the biggest difference between the Self-Defense Corps and the Self-Policing Corps was that the Self-Policing Corps was compulsory and the Self-Defense Corps had been an opt-in organization. So the Self-Policing Corps was announced the same month, March 1942, that the coming dissolution of the China Youth Corps and its Self-Defense Corps was announced. So clearly, maintaining peace and calm on the streets remained a priority, but I have not found any golden document explaining precisely why the Youth Corps' self-defense corps were eliminated and the self-policing corps were established. Okay, so what had changed? Well, I already told you about that investigation going on in late 1941 and the problems of infiltration. See, I already covered myself. I got ahead of myself, and so I've already talked about this part here. So scrolling down, even though these attacks did not stop, and even though all able-bodied 20 to 45-year-old men were required to go on patrol duty, and even though no one would stand out as a collaborator, this was still an incredibly fraught operation. And again, some of the motivations and some of the problems aren't spelled out entirely clearly, so there's a whole lot of surmising going on, at least at this point. So on March 30th, of 1942, the collaborationist commissioner of police informed the Shanghai Municipal Council, which still existed, this was the city council of the international settlement, that this was going to happen. All able-bodied men, 20 to 45, except for those serving in official organs, which meant those serving as police, detectives, members of police specials, fire brigades, and ambulance duty. They were exempt from patrol duty. Also, those who they described as invalids and those who have grave physical defects. Also, those who have previous criminal convictions. And finally, those who have been deprived of their civil rights, and that's not clearly defined. And how that might be distinct from those with prior criminal convictions. So one of the bodies in the international settlement that really got frustrated by this self-policing corps, this compulsory corps, was actually the Shanghai Municipal Council's Public Works Department. They registered repeated complaints with the collaborationist police department, which oversaw this, as well as with other authorities, about the demands of self-policing on its employees, because they were the ones collecting the garbage, they were the ones paving the roads, patching potholes, dealing with flooding issues, and all these public works kinds of things. The Deputy Commissioner of Public Works, who between April and July of 1942 was still a Westerner, he replied to the initial information announcing this that he presumed the employees of the Shanghai Municipal Council would be exempt from patrol duty during office hours, during business hours. But because patrol duty was a 24/7 undertaking, being exempt during office hours meant that council employees would be burdened by having to do overnight patrol while still having to report for their jobs the next morning on insufficient sleep. The collaborationist authorities were unimpressed by this argument, and they said only a small fraction of council employees would be called up at any one time and at the same time. And the duration of the duty is only 3 hours. Thirdly, the patrol work occurs on an average, but once a week or even once every 10 days per person, according to the density of the population of the area. But in June of 1942, the Public Works Department reported that 32 Chinese men from their department had been called for duty in the Self-Policing Corps during office hours in May. Some of them had been called multiple times because although there were 32 men, there had been 51 different occasions of self-policing duty. 35% of the duties were for periods over 3 hours, some for 12 hours, and in one case for 24 hours of patrol. 25% occurred within 10 days of a previous duty, and some instances of duty followed within 3 days. The senior Chinese member of the Public Works Department staff was called more than anyone else, and the department attempted to explain that his presence was urgently required during office hours due to his seniority and responsibilities, but his application for exemption from duties, along with other employees' applications, were rejected by the collaborationist regime. On top of these cases of duty during office hours, an additional 55 employees of the Public Works Department had been on patrol after office hours, but had had to report to duty as usual the next day, to work as usual the next day. Another complicating factor was that men were often informed around 6 p.m. that they were to be on duty the next day, and there was no standardized schedule. And so if they found out at 6 p.m. that they had to be on duty at 11 a.m. the next day, the only way to get the time changed was to show up at 9 a.m. and request a change, which usually took a couple hours, which meant they didn't get to work until 11 in the morning, and they may as well have simply done their duty in the middle of the day and missed those 3 hours of work. So there were many letters flying back and forth between, at this point, the still mostly Westerner-run Public Works Department and the occupation authorities for much of 1942 regarding these challenges. By 1943, however, the position of Director of Public Works was held by a Japanese man with the name of Kawakami. By this point, the vast majority of Westerners who had worked for the Shanghai Municipal Council were out. And if any of you saw that now very old movie, The Empire of the Sun, all these Westerners are rounded up and put into camps. That didn't happen for everybody right away. It happened right away for some, but not for everybody. And so I find that movie to be a slightly vague account because we don't have time markers. But it was over a period of time, which is why we still have many Westerners in pretty important positions in the Shanghai Municipal Council well into 1942. So Kawakami, who's now the director of Public Works, routinely wrote letters in support of Chinese employees of the Municipal Council, insisting that they be exempted from self-policing duty either during office hours or exempted entirely if their positions required them to be available at all times, as was the case for a man named T.T. Song, who was in charge of the construction work of the Markham Road pumping chamber and other flood prevention work. Clearly, he needed to be available when issues cropped up. But even in late August 1943, by which time the international settlement and French concession had been officially returned to so-called Chinese control, which is to say puppet regime control, there were still problems. There was a lengthy memo from a puppet government employee to the head of a district of the Self-Policing Corps making suggestions on significant improvements to the assigning of duty. The arbitrary nature of some people being assigned to frequent duty had made it difficult for people to continue to earn a living, he complained, and it was affecting their livelihood. One shift every 3 to 4 weeks per man would not be particularly burdensome on any individual or any government office or any place of business, he argued, which makes it very clear that there were still many people being called far more often than that. So what are the conclusions here? Well, the manpower shortages are obvious. If the Japanese could have, number one, patrolled it sufficiently themselves or recruited enough collaborators to function as a police presence everywhere, they wouldn't have needed to do this. Secondly, what comes through from the documents is the chaos of who was in charge here. With the written policies from the Japanese occupation authorities from shortly after Pearl Harbor being very clear on the restrictions and that no one should be called more frequently than once every 10 days and no particular patrol should last more than 3 hours, these were in black and white, and the still Western-run municipal council was constantly appealing directly to the Japanese authorities who replied, yes, of course, that's how it should be. And they blamed the local police stations who were the ones in charge of assigning people to duty. And so what was going on here? Why was the policy of the Japanese authorities not being implemented at all consistently? So the one question is, were those in charge of assigning duty in the police stations settling personal scores against people they didn't like or who they perceived had wronged them? There was a lot of that going on in Shanghai, to be sure. Was there a behind-the-scenes effort to undermine the Shanghai Municipal Council's functioning by assigning frequent duty to its employees? In other words, were the Japanese authorities saying this out of one side of their mouths, but in reality, they just wanted the Shanghai Municipal Council to go away? Not right away, because then they would have to replace it with something, but to make it sort of collapse on its own instead of looking like they were outlawing it at the flip of a switch. Were those who could afford to do so bribing their way out of patrol duty? Probably, yes. And again, it's also attempting to assume that not all of the chaos was unintentional. This issue of who was trying to gain an upper hand in a constantly evolving situation in Shanghai. So these are some of the questions I still need to address that I hope to do with my forthcoming trip to Shanghai. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mulready-Stone, for the presentation. We have about 35 minutes for questions and comments, so we have quite a bit of time.
We were supposed to have a third who was unable
We
to
were.
make it.
Dr. Rutherford unfortunately couldn't be with us today due to a family emergency, so we have more time than we might have. We don't necessarily need to fulfill. I'm sure there's more than enough conversation that will develop that will take us to 4 o'clock. Dr. Sutino, please lead us.
I would like to begin with a question for you, Kristin.
Yes.
That's a different image of Japanese occupation of China than is sort of out there in the popular consciousness right now, which is mass murder and killing all and looting all and burning all and extermination campaigns. And this seems to be a Japanese occupation regime that's kind of stymied by the timeless realities of dense urban life. Am I reading your findings correctly?
You are. And so the image that we all rightly have of that level of Japanese violence is really in the battle. And, I mean, you're all familiar, I assume, with the rape of Nanjing and the question that I asked earlier of Robert comparing the brothels in the Middle East and elsewhere to those in East Asia. After the rape of Nanjing, the Japanese forces and the Japanese leadership themselves were somewhat taken aback. They were defensive about it, to be sure, but that's when the comfort women came in. They didn't want a recurrence of that. And so that's when they really started putting comfort women in place so that that would be far less likely to happen again. And it never happened in this war again on that scale. That doesn't mean no rape happened, but nothing like the rape of Nanjing. And so it doesn't mean that there was not brutality after the rape of Nanjing, but there's nothing again at that scale. So once the forces had fled, or moved on, the battle had shifted to another location, there was relative calm. And so there was a succession of 3 primary collaborationist regimes in the greater Shanghai area, including a few provinces surrounding that. Initially, it was local. And so the one in Shanghai was known as the Great Wei government. And then there was another one after that before the final Wei regime. But the slogan from pretty early on after the fall of Shanghai and Nanjing was that this was the peace regime. And their slogan was anti-communism, peace, and national reconstruction. And the peace was we now have peace, was central. And so you're familiar with the whole Greater East Asian prosperity sphere, and the greatest euphemism of all time, in my opinion. But they really were trying to sell the notion of peace is better than war. And in order for the Japanese, and in order for that to work, there had to be peace. And so they were not, generally speaking, brutalizing the Chinese population unless you were a resistor, a clear resistor. There was all kinds of brutal stuff going on there. But a lot of the violence in Shanghai was assassinations across collaborationist and resistance lines. And people, like other places, constantly switched sides out of expediency. What's going to work for me next?
Strikes me that we still need to know a lot more about Japanese occupation policy in Asia.
Indeed, indeed, we do.
Dr. Indian?
Just kind of follow up on Robert's comment for Kristin. Really fascinating topic. I don't know much about what's going on in East Asia, the China theater, except when it comes to Hong Kong, which I've done some work on. And it seems that while at the same time that the international settlements are being occupied in December of 1941, the Japanese are also carrying out occupation of another Chinese city, but albeit one that is a crown colony.
Right.
And from my understanding of how they deal with Westerners in Hong Kong, how they deal with the Chinese population in Hong Kong, what they have to put in place there, it sounds very different from how they're behaving in Shanghai. I'm just wondering if you have, if you've done any work, if you know anything about why there might have been some differences, or if my understanding of that is flawed. Perhaps it was more common than there are differences.
Yeah, so I'm vaguely familiar with Hong Kong in this context. I haven't looked into that at all. I think part of it in Shanghai was that this was a years-long process. So after 1931 in particular, I pointed to that section on the map that was the Japanese quarter. The Japanese were also exerting increasing pressure from 31 to 41, but especially 37, on the Shanghai Municipal Council. And so it was no longer the case that the British and Americans who dominated the settlement could do whatever they wanted. They had to toe a certain line, and the line kept moving closer and closer to them over the course of that period of time. From the 1840s all the way up to 1942, the chairman of the Shanghai Municipal Council, the highest, the mayor, essentially, was either British or American, usually British, but there were plenty of Americans in there. Starting in January of 1942 until the settlement sort of ceases to exist in August of 43, it's a Japanese chairman of the council. And so I think it was a less abrupt process, number one. Number two, what I didn't really touch upon is that the high-ranking members of the council were the ones who were pretty immediately sent off to camps. The foreigners in Shanghai were extraordinarily optimistic. And there were people who left, to be sure, when war was coming, but many people left. They went to the Philippines, and then once things calmed down after the battle, they came back. Or they sent their wives and kids to Manila and then brought them back. And so they seemed to have a certain sense of invulnerability because of their extraterritoriality and because this had been the case for 100 years. They didn't think that something like Pearl Harbor was going to happen. And when it did, of course, they didn't know it was coming, and so those people were rounded up quickly. But the lower ranking people with the Western names remained in place. And so again, it's sort of guesswork here, but I assume that was because, again, the manpower problem. They couldn't just dissolve the Shanghai Municipal Council and make something new. They needed these lower ranking, less threatening Westerners who knew how things worked. So the guy who's running Public Works, the Deputy Commissioner of Public Works, was writing all of those notes until the Japanese guy became Director of Public Works. And so I think these were less threatening people who were just trying to do what they could do to stay out of trouble. And so it was expediency, I think. It was necessity from the perspective of the Japanese occupation authorities that they couldn't just take over. They needed to sort of milk these people dry.
But my understanding of Hong Kong was that they rounded up just about all the Westerners immediately. But I should probably go back and take a look at whether or not that's actually true.
Yeah, and I have no idea. But again, it would not surprise me if that were the case, because again, they had sort of acculturated the Westerners in Shanghai to, hey, you're not really in charge anymore. So they had become fairly compliant. Whereas it was a crown colony, they were absolutely in charge until, Pearl Harbor and then Hong Kong and all of the rest of that part of Southeast Asia.
That's fascinating. Thank you.
I have a question for Katrin, kind of a two-part question about how Beetz sets herself up at the end of the war. So the first question, you opened by talking about how she's digging up her garden and turning over these documents. Is she ever actually interrogated by American authorities before they move to this sort of next stage of kind of negotiating with her. And I ask that because a lot of times when you read a lot of these American intelligence interrogations of Nazis, sometimes it seems they have some background information on the person, and sometimes they don't. And they're really letting the German being interrogated kind of lead them. So things like the fact that her husband's in the POW camp and this sort of stuff. So how does that kind of work in the initial month? Is there ever a period where they're suspicious of her, or does it kind of start as a negotiation?
It's really quite wide. They show up at her house, I think on the 17th of June, and she digs up the stuff in her mom's garden. And on the 21st of June, they're talking about a potential operation. So there is no long setup, no nothing, which makes it so intriguing. And that's why I think there's this really important gender component in there.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously,
You don't think that would happen with a male?
no, they kind of know who she is, in the sense of, the broad outlines of the Chiano affair. So her name has been heard before. She comes recommended, quote unquote, by Hurdle. They don't trust Hurdle, but if Hurdle says she's important, interesting, she might have this stuff, they're certainly going to check up on that. And then they find a woman who's utterly prepared. I mean, who has the documents squirreled away, who, and I didn't notice, didn't speak about that. I mean, there is a very basic fact that she speaks, I mean, she's a linguist, so she speaks English, and very good English at that. So it's easy to communicate with her. This is really an important facet here. I should have mentioned that. It's easy to communicate with her. You don't need a translator. You don't need an American who has some German or who grew up in Germany working with their German, but you have an English-speaking Nazi there. It's bingo. And then there's this gender component also that she, I think, very much goes against the expectations people have of her. She's very young. She's ready to bargain. She seems to be open and so on and so forth. So to make a long story short, I think they have a broad understanding that there might be this woman, and that's about it. Everything else develops in that moment. And one of the things I find so shocking about those CIA files, is how quickly they move from come with us to, well, how about you work for us? And the other component I find so fascinating is how quickly she brings up that opportunity, the possibility of her working for them just a little bit. And the way how she plays coy about it, I find it quite amazing, saying, well, it would be smart to do that, but I don't want to do that type of work anymore, which is quite perfect.
I mean, there's lots of interrogations where Nazis are often working for American intelligence and kind of much more desperate.
In a much more desperate manner, but also, this is what I mean when I talk about the guys, because the guys basically come in and say, well, I'm going to show you how to run an intelligence service. Or I'm going to show you how to spy on the Kremlin. And then you have this youngish woman coming in saying, hey, I can solve a small problem for you, which is you want to learn more about Hedl. He likes me, so let me talk to him. It's very kind of, this very precise, I'm going to solve that particular issue for you. Very smartly done.
I have two questions, one for Katrin and one for Kristin. The first one for Katrin is about this the leverage of the Fairmont husband somewhere in the interview. I was not aware that the Americans use this kind of we have your person tactic, and I want to know whether that's unusual with her and whether it actually had any leverage over her, because you seem to paint it as a story of her agency and manipulation. Does the husband matter? Does he resurface in the story? Can I ask the question?
Yeah, sorry.
So give me a second for that. And the question for Kristin is about what these patrols, these collaborations patrols are doing. Because I know how Nazis use their collaborations police and it's largely to protect stuff and guard Jews. So what are the Japanese occupationist patrols, what are they actually doing when they go out on these missions? Okay.
You want to go first?
No, you go ahead.
Okay. So the POW husband, he met us for a little while, and then he's a POW ex-husband. But initially, when she is, I don't want to use the word arrested because she isn't arrested. She's interned. She's something in between. So the husband is very much in the picture. She's also concerned very much about her mother and her younger brother, who are living in the Soviet zone in Weimar. So that becomes a story for another day. What I find in the US documents is basically they call it a control factor. They say, we have this as a control factor, but they're very much implying, not always spelling it out, but at the end of the day, we don't need this control factor. We have it, but she's working with us just fine. But early on at one point, I'm trying to remember that, they say, we have as a control factor her ongoing liberty and her husband who is a POW. But it never appears in the sense that I would say they're really pressuring her. It's just out there. You are giving me a very critical view, Rob. Go.
It seems that these patrols were really quite different than that. And so I was actually looking very recently at a description of, as they tried to standardize what these things were doing, there's a very explicit description of how this is going to work. So there's going to be teams of 5 in charge of a certain sector. 1 patrolman will be on the corner of the street. 1 patrolman will be on the middle of the street. There will be a supervisor who will be surveilling. He'll be walking around the neighborhood, although the words they actually use in Chinese are the alleys and sub-alleys, because there's all these circuitous back alleys in Chinese old cities. Then the 4th and 5th will be doing the same thing as the 1st and 2nd. 1 will be on the corner of a street, 1 will be in the middle of the street. And so they've got an area of, I'm not sure how many blocks, but not many, because there's only 5 of them, with 1 circling around. They all have whistles, and if they see something that is of concern, they are to whistle loudly, blow their whistles loudly, and they all have the power to arrest people. And so so there's no element of what you were suggesting of, keeping an eye on Jews. There's nothing like that. Obviously it wouldn't be Jews. Sorry?
Are they armed?
They seem to be armed, but with the earlier iteration, with the self-defense corps, only select groups were armed. And so that's something I don't have specifics on. Some of them were, some of them weren't, but I don't yet know exactly how that worked out. Who was and who wasn't.
A Midwestern neighborhood watch there.
Kind of.
And not what I'm thinking of. I'm thinking.
Yeah, no, it's not. It does not
This is a
seem to
neighborhood
be
watch.
that. And so it truly is trying to prevent flare-ups. Because, getting back to the question that Rob asked, I don't mean to give the impression that the streets of Shanghai were peaceful and beautiful with flowers growing everywhere. They were not. And there was the collaborationist secret police, which was incredibly brutal. It was it terrorized people. But if you stayed in line and you were not a resistor and you did not arouse suspicion, you could pretty much go about your life in Shanghai fairly quickly after the end of the battle. Now, things had to be rebuilt, and the Japanese absolutely raided factories and took some of that equipment back to wherever they wanted it to be. Other factories in the region were transported en masse, piece by piece, to nationalist controlled territory. And so the economy was quite devastated in multiple ways, but industry did start back up. And so they were trying to get back to as stable and normal a life as possible. And for many people, it kind of was. The other thing that the Japanese authorities did was to make this puppet regime look very Chinese. And so in the case of the Collaborationist Youth Organization, they didn't, in contrast to the Communist Youth League and the nationalist equivalent of it, the Collaborationist one did not give any dates of on the glorious first day, because that was with the fall of the city. What they did instead was the same thing that the nationalists did, which was to hearken back to the glorious actions of youth in the recent past and say it was time for youth to step up again in that way. So they were trying to put a Chinese face on this puppet regime. And ultimately they really did so, because Wang Jingwei, who was in charge of the second regional collaborationist regime, so Shanghai, Nanjing, and surrounding provinces, he was a very high-ranking member of the Nationalist Party who got fed up with Chiang Kai-shek. They had been rivals, going way back to the time of Sun Yat-sen in the 20s. Chiang Kai-shek was right-wing GMD, Nationalist Party, and Wang Jingwei was left-wing. Wang Jingwei was in favor of cooperating with the communists in the 20s in the First United Front. Chiang Kai-shek was always against that. And so Wang Jingwei did initially go to Wuhan and then on to Chongqing as the government fled, but in Chongqing became enormously frustrated with Chiang Kai-shek and then fled to Hanoi, where he met with Japanese authorities there, and they transported him back to Nanjing, where he declared, the nationalist government has returned to Nanjing. But it was nationalist government B, not nationalist government A. And so truly trying to put a very patriotic face on the collaborationist regime. And so this filtered all the way down. They wanted it to look Chinese. And so what they did, well, the best thing that happened to Wang Jingwei is that he died before the end of the war, because he would have had, of illness, not of assassination or anything. He would have had a horrific experience had he survived to the end of the war.
Dr. Barbie?
So, Katrin, a couple of things strike me. Okay. That it seems like Betz's story is a fairly unique one. But I think what may not be so unique is the relationship she establishes with U.S. military, well, with U.S. intelligence and the CIA after the war. If you look at their track record with establishing connections with people who can do something useful, right? So Operation Paperclip, right? How many of those people come to the United States with questionable backgrounds that they don't actually investigate very hard? And there's also not a lot of interaction between, say, those who, INS, who's looking at applications for people coming to the U.S., and military intelligence. So there's not a lot of conversation. So then all of a sudden, many years later, when somebody gets investigated, it's like, oh, I didn't know he did that. Or I didn't know she, whatever. So in the sense, I know mercenary is not the right word, but they're opportunistic, right? So that if they come across somebody who is going to perform a useful service, they get into bed with, as Rob and I will talk about in a couple of nights, with Otto von Goldschmidt, right? And because he's not honest about his background, but they don't really check that much into his background, because he promises to bring, he helps them capture the Nazis they want to capture and to bring them. So at times they don't question it very much, I think.
No, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, there's in that sense, there's nothing much unusual about it. I'm looking at this more from her perspective to quite some extent, because what is unusual is the female part here. So there are far fewer women in this position, and I mean, the broad project I'm working on here is it's a biographical treatment to some extent, but I'm also thinking about this as some sort of a case study. What does it mean to be ambitious and female in 20th century Germany? How do I make this work? How do women create those spaces where good things come to them? And in that, so I find more interesting how she creates this space which works for her, rather than looking at the way, of course the Americans and the Soviets and the Brits took on people with a problematic past, to put it mildly. And compared to them, she is actually very small fry.
Right.
I mean, compared to them, she's golden.
But it seems like that aspect of her carving out her own space and taking agency and figuring out what she wants to do is very similar to Lily Shageyev, who is not German, Lily Shageyev, who was Russian but grew up in France and volunteers to work for German intelligence as a way to then work against, because she's opposed to German occupation, right? And so she very much, she gets frustrated when they don't send her out into the field soon enough, and she's afraid the war is going to be over before she can do her part. And so, and she considers herself more competent than anybody that she works with, both first the Germans and then the British, right? And so, in many respects, I'm seeing some parallels between these two women who are both working with the Germans, but one is actually in Germany, although Lily goes back and forth to Germany multiple times as she's being trained in a way in which they don't seem to train the men before they send them off to spy in England. But
Details.
yeah, yeah.
Dr. Satina?
So Katrin, let me just follow. So Hildegard gave a great story about, that's fascinating stuff, by the way. She then changes her name, becomes a journalist?
Yes.
And so this is how you hide, right? You
I mean, it's actually quite brilliant what's going on there, because she sets herself up, or is set up. It's always both,
right,
in this fascinating position in Frankfurt and then in Bonn. So she becomes a very actually, there are two important female journalists in Germany in the 1970s and 80s. One is Wiebke Bruns, who just turned 80 and change, 80. The other one is Hilde Purwin.
Hilde Purwin.
Yeah,
right.
Hilde Purwin. So it's her. And there's this really intriguing thing, because along the way she marries into SPD royalty. So, you know, a working class union royalty, gets divorced again, but for some reason she has all those amazing contacts. So she has the contacts with the CDU people, she has the SPD contacts, so she knows everybody and his cousin. And she's working for the Telegraph, and I've started reviewing what she's writing, and my assumption was, you know, in the late 50s, early 60s, she just had a child, she's getting back to working. So presumably she is not writing all that much for the newspaper. So Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays, she's basically filling the A section on her little own. And she is doing the high-level political stuff very early on. So there's something very intriguing going on in how she makes this universe for herself.
I think of the West German journalistic community, which was riddled with former Nazis writing under aliases. So Heinz Bonkartz is Jürgen Tortall.
Yeah.
Karl Paul Schmidt is Paul Carell, the famous Paul Carell.
But you know, there's a strange thing going on, because my assumption was for the longest time that everybody knew about her background,
Right.
but apparently not.
Apparently not.
Which I can't quite believe. Because that's at least what the Sun told a friend of mine, which I can't quite believe, that also nobody knew about her background in Italy.
Right.
I mean, there was the whole Ciano affair.
Right.
But the word in the streets is they didn't know? Like, seriously? So nobody was talking? You didn't run across each other kind of in the bar in Rome?
It's fascinating stuff.
Yeah, so I'm
Your next book can be on journalism in West Germany.
No, hopefully not. But you know, I'm trying to sort this one out. And yes, there's similar cases, but I think this is still a very intriguing case to make some broader statements and to think about broader issues.
She seems pretty good about reinventing herself
She's
and making it believable.
She's brilliant at it, but I really love this little comment about maybe she's just damn good at telling the men what they want to hear. You know, that
Or
comes.
she's attractive enough that they're not going to pay
They're not
attention.
paying attention.
Oh,
I
she's
don't
a
know.
female James Bond.
I wouldn't take it that far.
Colin? I have a question for Kristin.
Yes.
It seems like the colonization of East Asia is something that the Japanese ran into a lot when they were expanding. Was that something they were prepared for in the occupation of these major cities? Because it seemed different in each area. Was that something they prepared for when they first began the invasion of China?
Yeah, so they replicated this process all over, because there were different puppet governments in different parts of China. They never unified it and had one puppet regime, because they never controlled the whole country in part. And they always controlled somewhat isolated territory. But it looked, I mean, I haven't studied the other areas in depth the way I have this area, but sometimes, you know, the documents say, as in the, you know, regime in North China, blah, 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 blah. And so it was similar, but there were different organizations. So this China Youth Corps youth organization that was in the Greater Shanghai area did not exist under the other puppet regimes, but there were, different iterations of it. So they were prepared for it. They were very clear on the fact that there were these concession areas in many, many cities. They wanted them, and they were always trying to trap the Westerners into violating their neutrality. And they came close to accomplishing it during the Battle of Shanghai, which is another story, which is in my book. But they tried to provoke them, they tried to entrap them, they tried to use things that the Chinese did and say, you're letting the Chinese fly their flag and that's a violation. No, we're not letting them do it. We took it, we confiscated it when they did that, all these kinds of things. So it goes back to the question that Robert asked earlier, was it like it was in Hong Kong? No, because it evolved over a period of time. So the Japanese had been present in China for quite some time, very much so, of course, in Manchuria, going way back, but increasingly in the 30s in places like Shanghai. And so there's, Akira Irie's book on the origins of World War II in Asia and the Pacific, I think does a very good job of sort of marking moments in time when the Japanese are playing by the rules of the internationalist system through the 20s until it's no longer to their advantage. And they're mad that the Westerners are sort of starting to turn away from imperialism and want the Japanese to do the same. And they're saying, we just got in on this act. It's not fair, essentially. They don't say those words, but that seems to be their reaction. So they were very clear on that situation and to a certain extent, a significant degree, I would say, bided their time because they tried to provoke the Westerners, but they also didn't want to provoke them in a way that was going to work against them. And again, given the manpower problem that they had, they were sort of straddling a little bit of a precarious situation at times.
We have about 4 minutes left, so if someone else has 1 or 2 more quick questions, we can entertain them before we wrap up.
Well, you shut that down.
At this point, everybody's staring at you.
Just trying to adhere.
Well,
I would welcome everyone